Do you see that her birth date and her social security number are redacted?
I do see that, yes.
Other than those redactions, is Exhibit 354 a true and accurate copy of the death certificate that you certified as to Ms. Mullis's death?
That portion that I described that I certify, I can say yes. The decedent information portion is the responsibility of the funeral home, so I'm not necessarily comfortable saying that's true. I don't know where she lived.
Other than the decedent information section, did you complete the remainder of this death certificate?
Most of it, yes, not that funeral home portion at the bottom, but really that central area.
Understood. Did you complete the portion of this death certificate that provides a medical cause of death?
Yes.
And what did you certify as the medical cause of death for Ms. Mullis?
Sharp force injuries of torso.
Is it your opinion in this case that the injuries that Ms. Mullis had on her torso were sharp force injuries?
Yes.
And this death certificate does this death certificate provide a space to explain what the injuries that you identify as the cause of death are due to or as a consequence of?
Yes, that's what it said. In this case, there really wouldn't be anything appropriate to put underneath that.
And why is that?
So sharp force injuries of torso are essentially, well, there are two components of the cause of death on a death certificate. There's the immediate cause of death, whatever condition, injury that ultimately led someone to die right away. That can be due to something else, which is called the underlying cause of death. That immediate cause of death sometimes can be so specific it really doesn't belong on the death certificate, because ultimately a death certificate is for vital statistics purposes, tracking diseases, injury trends. So that underlying cause of death is really the most important, which is what I put. So the sharp force injuries of torso is that underlying cause of death. If you wanted to put something above it into immediate cause of death, like pneumothorax, something along those lines, you could. But in my opinion, in this case, the sharp force injuries of torso is perfectly sufficient for cause of death.
And did you identify in this certificate the immediate cause of death as you just described?
I did not. And in this case, with an injury that happens quickly like this, one could argue you're getting into mechanism of death territory, which we are instructed not to do by the CDC. So to me, her death was sharp force injuries of torso.
Did you include on this death certificate what the place of her injury was?
Yes.
And what did you say on Ms. Mullis's death certificate the place of her injury was?
Farm building.
Isn't it true that at the time, that by your testimony, at the time you determined the cause and manner of her death, you did not know in your mind where she'd been injured?
Yes.
At the time that you determined that Ms. Mullis's death was a homicide, did you want any context about what Ms. Mullis had been doing earlier that day?
Want is an interesting word. I do like having information about the circumstances surrounding the death, so sure, I would want more information such as that.
At the time you determined that Ms. Mullis's death was a homicide, did you have any information about what Ms. Mullis had been doing earlier in the day that she was injured?
I believe I did. I believe she was working on the farm in some capacity.
Where did you get information about her working on the farm at the time that you determined that Ms. Mullis's death was a homicide?
That would be from law enforcement.
Isn't it true that that's not information you learned until after you had determined that this was a homicide?
I suppose I can't recall clearly. We received a lot of information in a short period of time, so it's definitely possible I learned it after, but it's a pretty simple bit of information. I don't think it would take too much digging to get that.
Well, in this case, Dr. Cruz, Did you receive a lot of information in a short period of time before you determined that Ms. Mullis's death was a homicide?
I guess it's your opinion is that a lot of information. I had information about the circumstances surrounding her death. I didn't have finalized law enforcement reports, and as we established, I can't recall if I had her medical records or not. So I didn't have what one would consider a ton of information, but I didn't need it.
The only information you had at the time you determined this was a homicide was information that you saw at autopsy and that you got from talking with Deputy Hemosath and with Dr. Thompson, correct?
As far as I recall, yes.
And that was not a lot of information.
I suppose that's your opinion.
Well, I'm asking if, in your opinion, was it a lot of information?
The judge didn't ask an answer, and she's also being argumentative at this point.
Sustained.
At the time that you determined that Ms. Mullis's death was a homicide, did you want any information about the prescription medications that Ms. Mullis was taking?
No, but I had it. Oh, I'm sorry, after the autopsy, I did get that information.
And to be clear, I'm asking about at the time you determined this was a homicide. At that time, you did not know anything about prescription medications that she was taking?
Not that I recall, no.
At the time that you determined that Ms. Mullis's death was a homicide, did you want any information about what emergency responders had observed when they provided her with medical aid?
I do want information about what emergency responders saw, and very much so about what they do, or what they did as part of their resuscitative efforts.
You testified a moment ago about being concerned in your testimony today about injuries that were on the front of Ms. Mullis's body. You know now that Ms. Mullis had resuscitative efforts on her way to the hospital, is that right?
Yes.
Did those resuscitative efforts include her receiving CPR?
Yes.
And did those resuscitative efforts include the use of something called a Lucas device?
Yes.
Can CPR and the use of a Lucas device bruise someone's chest?
Yes.
Is it common for those actions to bruise someone's chest?
Bruise or abrade the chest, yes.
And so the any blunt force injuries that you observed on Ms. Mullis's chest that were in the area where CPR is performed, are those injuries that you would expect to be associated with CPR?
It can be difficult if someone has injuries to begin with and CPR is performed in that same area, but I think it's reasonable to say that at least some of the injuries could be from CPR.
Well, in this particular case, would you as a forensic pathologist assume that injuries in that area would be connected with CPR?
I think it's most likely, and I did so. She had a sternal fracture that I determined to be related to CPR.
And you mentioned this a moment ago. At the time that you determined that Ms. Mullis's death was a homicide, did you have any of her medical records from Regional Medical Center?
I do not recall.
Do you remember what day of the week you did Ms. Mullis's autopsy?
Yes.
What day of the week was it?
Monday.
And what day of the week was Ms. Mullis brought into Regional Medical Center?
It was a Saturday.
Isn't it true that you did not get Ms. Mullis's medical records until after you conducted the autopsy in this case?
I think that's the most likely scenario.
The Iowa Court of Appeals affirmed that conviction later on direct appeal. And here we are in a post-conviction relief proceeding, which Mr. Mullis has brought and commenced to attack his conviction again. The evidence will show, and the evidence has in fact already shown, that Mr. Mullis took the stand at the underlying trial and agreed that Amy Mullis was murdered. He agreed on cross-examination that somebody took a corn rake and stabbed Amy Mullis in the back 2 or 3 times. He agreed on cross-examination that he actually knew this wasn't an accident. And yet we are here today to ensure justice and a fair trial occurred. The evidence will show that sufficient evidence still exists to support the murder conviction of Todd Mullis' murder conviction. The evidence was enough for the Court of Appeals to affirm it, and the evidence will be enough for the court to deny this post-conviction relief application in its entirety. Many, many claims are brought pending before the court right now, but the important evidence was presented at trial. And a shrapnel shot approach or a shot in the dark, in a way, is not a way to hit the mark here. The evidence will show certainly that expert testimony will not be enough to attack what the evidence actually showed at trial and what has already been upheld on appeal. And that's that Todd Mullis murdered his wife, Amy Mullis. And so at the end of this, the state will ask the court to deny his post-conviction relief application and let his conviction stand to ensure that a just trial had occurred already, and find that his conviction of first-degree murder should stand. Thank you.
And then the first time it analyzed, it said no shock advised, which meant it did not pick up that shockable rhythm, continue CPR, so we continued CPR.
Okay. And when you pushed your patient's clothing up, did you make any observations about other injuries?
Yeah, we looked, as we lifted up her shirt, we were looking for some other things to see because I was still trying to figure out how this injury happened. There was what appeared to be possibly a slight bruise on the right rib cage. At that point, it was very faint. We thought maybe it was a bruise, but we weren't 100% sure. And then there was also a mark above her right breast that looked possibly like a very small puncture wound, but again, we weren't 100% sure what we were looking at. We saw something there, but had not, were not able to determine what had caused that. So we made note of it in our report.
Did you observe anything, any injuries on her face area?
Again, possibly a slight bruise on the right side that was noted in the report. Again, at the time that we saw her, it appeared very faint. We thought it was possibly a bruise, but we were not 100% sure. So again, we noted it in the report.
Okay. After you set up the AED, did you then do the Lucas device?
Yes. Once we did the first analyzing with the AED and said no shock advised, continue CPR. I continued manual chest compressions, and then Dave and the deputy started setting up the Lucas device. Dave started and the deputy assisted with getting everything in place. I continued manual compressions until the Lucas was in place and could start.
Okay. And you were able to utilize the Lucas to do chest compressions?
Yes, and then once it was in place, we turned it on and the Lucas took over chest compressions.
What did you do after that?
Then I went back to the ambulance to get the airway bag to secure an airway and to start breathing for the patient. So I brought the airway bag back to the patient, opened it up. I took out a King LT. That was the intubation device preferred at the time. And so that's what I took out. At the time that I had gotten that out, then that's when Manchester arrived on scene.
Okay.
I apologize for the interruption, but could we have a quick sidebar?
Sure. Thank you, Your Honor. Ms. Pierce-Bacher, maybe act like we're high schoolers, I guess, and we don't listen the first time and just go slow for us. But we were talking about an airway bag, and could you help us all understand a little bit about what you were using? I think we've all seen mouth to mouth, and so tell me about the airway bag.
Okay, so our airway bag specifically carries all of the equipment that we would need if a patient were to have a breathing problem. There is an oxygen tank in that airway bag. There is also it's called an AMVU bag. It's the bag that you put over their mouth and squeeze to help ventilate them, that we carry in there. There is also nasopharyngeal airways, which go into the patient's nose, and oral airways, which are hard airways that go into the patient's mouth that are used to hold the tongue out of the way. Those airways are used for a patient who is still semi-conscious and would have a gag reflex, who would not tolerate anything down their throat. In this particular case, we used a King LT, which is a long tube that is inserted into the patient's mouth, and it goes into their trachea, and there are 2 balloons that blow up to hold it into place, and then there's a small opening at the top that ambu bag I was talking about. If you take the mouthpiece off, the round tip goes right onto the top of the King airway, and then we can ventilate directly into the patient's lungs. So that is what I was getting, the airway bag, and that's what we had decided was our best option for that patient at that time.
Okay. And was your patient responsive at all?
No.
And in order to insert the tube then into your patient, did you have to do anything with her mouth or her nose?
Yes. So when I inserted the tube, what I did is I positioned myself at her head so that she was directly in front of me. I was at the top of her head. Other people were still working on doing things with her. I was kneeling on the ground above her head, and then what I do to insert is I reach through and I grab her lower jaw and her tongue, and I lift it up to pull the tongue out of the way and to open her mouth. And then with my other hand, I take the tube and insert it into her airway, and then we have a syringe that then blows up those balloons to hold that tube into place.
Okay. Earlier you mentioned that the right side of your patient's face had blood or maybe a vomit substance.
Yes.
Was that still present when you were inserting the tube?
It was still present, and before the tube was inserted, we used a suction device to suction her mouth clean and clear so that we could get the tube in without getting any extra debris into her airway.
Would getting debris in her airway be harmful to your efforts to get her breathing?
Well, it could, because then it would be basically like aspirating whatever that was, and then it would just cause further problems for the patient down the road.
Okay. And I think you mentioned that as you were working to do this, the Manchester paramedics arrived.
Yes, the Manchester crew arrived because at first when they arrived, we filled them in on the situation and told them what we had done so far and what we knew. And then I actually backed off on the airway for a moment just because at that time it was their scene to control. And I just said, we're about to insert an airway. And then that's when they said, well, you are an EMT, you can do that skill, right? And I said, yes, I can. And then they said, please do help us. And so we stayed on scene and continued to help them as they were doing what they were doing.
And in addition to suctioning out the mouth and the nose, did you also have to move her face or handle, wipe things off of her?
I don't remember if we did any wiping. I do know we did have to suction, and then her head was turned slightly to the right, so we would have pulled her head back to center to make it easier to insert that tube.
Okay. After you inserted the airway tube, what do you remember doing next?
At that point, then we hooked up the airway bag, and I started to ventilate for her. The ventilations were going in harder than I expected them to. I was feeling some resistance, which is not normal. But at that time, that's when we were getting ready to move the patient. They had brought a sheet from one of the ambulances. And so the way that we lifted her that day is we did something called a log roll, where we roll the patient onto her side, put the sheet under her, pull it back out from the other side, and now she's laying on a sheet instead of on the bare ground. And then we're able to use that sheet to lift her and get her onto the cot and into the ambulance. So the sheet was the method that we used that day to get her up onto the cot and loaded. So at the time I got the airway in place was the time that we rolled her, got her onto the sheet, and moved her towards the ambulance. I was ventilating the whole way to the ambulance. When we got to the ambulance, I did tell the paramedic, please check this airway. There's more resistance than there should be. Make sure I got it right. And then I handed the airway bag off to one of the Manchester personnel, and they continued care to Manchester.
Did you note any other injuries during that log roll procedure?
During the log roll procedure, I did not see any other injuries myself. As the patient was rolled, I moved with her face to continue to give ventilations. I did hear one of the Manchester responders say, "We have a through and through," when they saw her back. I personally never saw her back at the scene. I don't know what it looked like, but I did hear one of the Manchester responders make that comment.
Did you note any other injuries to her mouth, a cut, or anything like that?
No.
And in your experience, is the act of performing CPR or using a Lucas device a traumatic event to the body?
It can be, yes.
Was your care ending then as the patient was loaded into Manchester's ambulance?
Yes, that is where our care of the patient ended. We handed off to Manchester. Shortly after Manchester ambulance arrived on scene, so did Manchester first responders, because they were paged out after. So between those two crews, they got enough people in the back of the ambulance to continue care all the way to Manchester. So it was Manchester's full ambulance crew. And then I believe a couple of their first responders who came out in the first responder rig also went back with them to be extra hands to help with resuscitation. So we were not needed to go in the ambulance with them. They had enough people.
Okay. And at some point, do you learn the patient's name?
Yes, as we were loading her into the ambulance, one of the Manchester responders or ambulance members said, "We need a name and a birth date for the victim." And then that's when we asked, "What is her name and birth date?" And that's when we learned it was Amy Mullis. Up until that point, I didn't realize who we were working on.
Had you met Amy Mullis before November 10th, 2018?
Yeah, we were acquaintances. Amy's and Todd's daughter was in gymnastics with my daughter, so we would see each other at gymnastics events, and they also attended the same church as us.
Did you realize the individual providing information to you during your care was Todd Mullis?
I did not realize that either at the time. It was out of context. I was used to seeing him together with the family, and this was out of context. So no, I did not place that. That was Todd as well.
Can you describe Todd's demeanor while you were on the scene?
From what I observed, he seemed to be kind of anxious, nervous. He seemed to be pacing in the background. He wasn't interfering with resuscitation efforts at all, but he was close by to provide information as we would need it. As if we would start to talk about something or ask something, he would respond right away with information he had or knew. But yeah, he was close by enough to give information, was pacing.
Nothing that alarmed you?
No.
I'm sorry, start over. Did you also then know Todd and Amy's children?
I did. At that point in time, I knew the younger two children better. Wyatt and Taylor went to church with us. I was their Sunday school teacher for a while. I knew Tristan also at that point from seeing him in church with the family, but I did not know him as well as I knew the younger two.
Did you see Tristan on November 10th, 2018?
Yes, a little bit later. Up until that point, I had not noticed him. After Amy was loaded into the ambulance and Manchester took off for the hospital, we turned to start getting our stuff picked up, and that's when I realized Tristan was there as well. He was standing back a lot further than Todd. There was a trailer attached to the pickup that they had been using to try to get Amy to the hospital, and he was on the back side of the trailer.
After the Manchester ambulance left, what did you and the other Greeley EMTs do?
Because some of the Manchester first responders had left in the ambulance service, or in the Manchester ambulance, that left a couple of their first responder vehicles unmanned. So our other responder, Steve, who was on scene, he actually helped Manchester to get the rest of their vehicles back to their station. Dave and I took the ambulance and we followed to Manchester because our Lucas device was still being used in resuscitation efforts. And so we said we would just follow and wait for it to be done to get it back. So we proceeded to Manchester. We stopped at the fire station we stopped at Manchester Fire Station to pick our other responder, Steve, up because that's where they keep their first responder vehicles after he helped them drop those off. And then the three of us proceeded to the hospital to wait for the Lucas.
Okay. When you got to the hospital, where did you go?
We just went into the common area in the ER, the hallways. We were just planning to hang out in a corner and try to stay out of the way until things were done.
And did you observe Todd Mullis or any of the other family there as well?
Todd, I believe, was there and had a friend with him. And they were in kind of the family waiting room. They had a special waiting room, not the general public waiting room that everyone goes into. There's a separate one back in the ER for family to wait in. And so he was in there with a friend.
Your Honor, with the court's permission, I'll stand just for this opening portion of the proceedings today.
Certainly.
Good morning, Your Honor. Todd Mullis has always believed that his wife, Amy Mullis's death was a tragic accident. He always believed this because he was on his family farm the day that she was injured. He was there right after his son, Tristan, found her. He was there as he and his son, Tristan, tried to give Miss Mullis emergency aid and rushed her to where EMTs could get her to the hospital. He was there when first responders treated her injuries like they were the result of an accident. And he was not aware of any information that would tell him that what happened to her was anything other than an accident. Even when police began an investigation and began to treat him like a suspect, he did not stop believing that what happened to Miss Mullis was an accident. He knew he had nothing to do with her death, and he didn't believe that there was any evidence that anyone else did either. His account of what happened and his beliefs, unlike the accounts of some of the people that you're going to hear in this post-conviction trial during this week, has always been the same. But at trial, he did not have any way to present evidence to the jury that this was an accident. And that issue is what the court's going to hear about over the course of this hearing. The court's going to hear evidence that he begged his attorneys, begged them all through pretrial preparation to investigate this case as an accident. The court's going to hear evidence that his lawyers disregarded what he was telling them. The court's going to hear evidence that his lawyers did not talk to experts or fact witnesses that would have helped them understand and present a case that this was an accident. And the court's going to hear evidence that his lawyers did not listen to his explicit direction to investigate these issues and to pursue this case as an accident. And because his attorneys did not listen to him, because his attorneys did not investigate or present these issues, the jury did not hear important evidence that they needed to hear to understand that the state's case was simply wrong. The jury heard the exact opposite of what Todd Mullis asked his lawyers to present. They heard his own lawyer in opening statements tell the jury that Todd didn't know what he was talking about, that Ms. Mullis was murdered. They heard his own lawyer, in effect, tell the jury that Mr. Mullis was not credible. They heard his own lawyer make these concessions on day one, right when this trial began, and then really have no defense to present on Todd's behalf. His lawyers conceded guilt in this case without any plan to present another defense. The court is going to hear evidence that Todd didn't agree to this plan. He didn't know this was the plan. He'd actually asked his attorneys to do the opposite. And at this point in the proceedings, the court has heard in various pleadings at other hearings that we've had, the PCR team for Todd repeat this to you over and over again in all of the filings, that this was an accident, that this is what this case is about. And we've repeated that to the court because it's true. And it's among just the many reasons that Todd Mullis deserves a new trial and what this court is going to hear at this hearing. On behalf of Mr. Mullis and his team, we're grateful that after all this time that Mr. Mullis is able to be in court this morning to remedy this wrong. Nobody listened to Todd at trial, but this week he'll have an opportunity to be heard through this case. And the court is going to hear other important evidence as well that the jury never heard that is going to create at least the reasonable probability that the outcome of his trial would have been different if the jury had heard everything that the court is going to hear over the course of this trial.
So there's a piece of them, like the circular or the rounded piece that moves around? Is that right?
No, this would just be like a smaller version would be like an ice auger.
Okay. I'm sorry, I still don't know what that is, but did you step on these augers?
No.
Did you touch them?
No,
Did you attempt to manipulate them or move them in any way?
no.
I want to show you Exhibit 269 now. When you're in that walkway, what's to the right of you?
Be like a throw bale wagon for hay?
Did you make any observations about what was in that wagon?
I don't recall.
Have you seen this photo before?
So there's tanks in the wagon.
I'm sorry, can you just repeat that?
There's tanks in the wagon,
Tanks.
water or chemical tanks. The way that's what this picture displays.
Do you also see a stuffed animal, a kid's toy?
Yes.
Counsel, just for the record, which exhibit is this? There's a number of stickers on it.
This has been marked 269 for the purposes of the post-conviction. At trial, it was, I think, I can't read that, 103.
Thank you.
Okay. You can take that down. Thank you. Mr. Himaseth, did you talk with Todd or Tristan Mullis on November 10th?
No.
Did your other deputies in your office talk with them?
Yes.
Did you review their reports?
Yes.
And have you reviewed any body cam, video, or audio of those interviews?
No.
Did you also review a report written by the sheriff at the time, Mr. Leclerc?
Yes.
And I believe these have already been admitted, but I'm referring to Exhibit 201 and 221 regarding Sheriff Leclerc's report and his deposition. Have you had an opportunity to review any of the depositions given in this matter?
Not of other people, no.
Okay. And then Exhibit 318 is Thompson's report, and 264 is Holub's report. Do you recall whether your theory when you left the farm November 10th, what your theory was regarding how Ms. Mullis died?
I honestly didn't have a theory. I asked Deputy Thompson to walk me out there, or take me out there, and to describe what was explained to him. My next step after that was just the autopsy.
When did you learn there was going to be an autopsy?
I believe the next day.
When you were on the farm and in the shed, did you find anything that disproved the idea or the theory that Ms. Mullis had tripped and fallen?
No.
So you said a moment ago, I think, that the next day you learned there was going to be an autopsy. Do you remember who you learned that from?
I don't. I'm assuming that was communicated from the hospital.
Do you recall having conversations with Mr. Leclerc?
We had a lot of conversations. John and I did. He may have told me, or Mike Croffle. I know Mike Croffle with DCI was contacted. John had contacted him, so I may have heard it from Mike too.
So, John or Mr. Leclerc was having conversations with DCI agent Croffle?
Yes.
And were you a part of those, or you just were told about them?
No, I wasn't a part of those. I was just told about it.
What else happened on November 11th?
November 11th?
Yes, the second day of your investigation.
I believe I came in and then I was briefed on the rest of it. We had conversations with DCI. I talked with John, and the next step was, I believe I had a conversation with DCI Special Agent Mike Croffel about attending the autopsy. That was the next thing I did, I believe, in the case.
Were you aware that Mike Croffel told LeClaire to lock Todd into his story on the 10th?
Objection, hearsay.
Overruled.
I learned that from reviewing his report.
Do you recall any other investigative activities on the 11th?
Not offhand, no.
Do you know what happened next in the investigation?
I went to the autopsy.
Do you recall what date that was?
I don't.
If the autopsy report is dated November 12th, 2018, would you accept that?
Yes.
There's been testimony about another deputy we haven't talked about yet, Keith Rowley.
Yes.
Who's Keith?
Keith was a deputy at the sheriff's office during this time.
And is he no longer a deputy?
Correct, he retired.
What did you learn about Deputy Rowley as it related to your investigation?
We had learned that he had a previous affair before this incident with Amy Mullis.
What were the dates of that affair?
That I don't know. I was just told it was way before this incident, and that him and his wife were in a good place at the time that this incident occurred.
For clarity of the record, when this incident occurred, you're talking about Amy's death on November 10th?
Yes.
Okay. So there's been testimony about clearing Deputy Rowley as a suspect. Do you recall that?
Yes.
Were you involved in that?
Not directly, no.
Why was that?
That was between the sheriff and DCI.